Okay. Good evening, Alex. How you doing?
Doing well. It's actually Josh, so that's a shared account my wife and I have. So,
Oh, okay, Josh. Okay,
yeah.
sorry. Okay.
Yep.
Oh, good evening, Josh.
Yep.
Are you going to run for which district?
Yeah, I'm the Libertarian candidate for the Indiana House of Representatives for District 22. So that's
Hmm.
predominantly Kosciuszko County, and I believe there's a bit of Wabash County with the new district lines.
Okay. So, why do you want to run for the office?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think like many people, I've been disappointed in what I've seen out of the political establishment
Hmm.
for quite a while. I guess I'm a bit more politically active or aware than most people, but I was always more of an observer or a spectator in that regard.
Right.
Um, and these last couple of years, I think through COVID and some of the policies that were handed down and some of the things that we saw out of our elected leadership, it sort of I don't know. I guess it crossed the line of sorts for me, and I just, um, I kept hoping that we would find someone who would step up and, change things or restore things or move them a bit more in line with, the America that I thought I knew,
Right.
and I just wasn't seeing that happen. And so, at some point, if nobody else will do it, the best thing you can do is step up and do it yourself, right?
Yes. Right. Yeah. So, are you always a libertarian?
That's an excellent question. So I grew up in a household that was not politically oriented at all. So
Okay.
there was almost no discussion of politics growing up. And then I used to watch a lot of like documentaries and informational, let's say, content. So a lot of the media I consumed had a slightly leftward bias.
Okay.
So through like my college years, I was what I would call like a default liberal,
Okay.
right? I assumed I was a Democrat because they always bill themselves as sticking up for the little guy, and
Right.
and we're here fighting against evil oppressors and whatnot, and that very much resonates with me.
Hmm.
But as I got older and started paying more attention, it just little cracks kept forming in that messaging,
Okay.
and I kept encountering things that just didn't quite make sense. So I started broadening my media diet, and I dabbled a bit with Republicans, but I found there's a lot of things I'm not necessarily in agreement on with them,
Mm.
and my personal values are much more of a sort of a classical liberalism Enlightenment style of values,
Okay.
which is much more in line with what the Libertarian Party represents.
Right, right. So, does that, like you said, you kind of, uh, the message of the Democrat resonated with you? Is that because your background? I mean, I mean,
I think so. I mean,
okay,
I'm from a relatively, lower income, working class, what have you background, right?
right.
And when you're used to growing up on the lower end of things, and you see the largesse and all of the things other people have, I think it's very easy to engender some feelings of resentment or jealousy or whatnot. And I think that a lot of the messaging from the left is very effective at picking up on that and uh, capitalizing on it, let's say.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like I grew up in China, so like grew up. I mean, both my parents were communists,
Mhm.
and but I didn't want to be a communist. But still, my upbringing kind of make me more. Uh, it's easier for me to identify with Democrats when I moved to Canada, and easier to identify with the liberals. And but when I moved to United States, that's where I noticed something which is different from what I used to hear from the media. And so I did my graduate study in Vancouver, Canada, which is very liberal, uh,
Right.
which I mean, in a way I kind of enjoyed it because you can do whatever you want in a way. Nobody's telling you that yeah, it is wrong, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah, you don't have that moral judgment to be put on you. But on the other hand, I start to notice that the government has a lot of control over us.
Mm-hmm.
But now when I came to the United States, that makes such a big contrast, from a West Coast liberal to a conservative Middle West. And I started seeing from the side of the conservatives. So I kind of became a conservative kind of over the years.
So that's exactly how they get you, right? That's why I say default liberal, right? You're sort of brought up with media and whatnot, and it sort of leans you a certain way. And there's a lot of stereotypes or talking points or things, there's a lot of straw man arguments you hear, right?
Right.
And then you start actually listening to folks who are on the conservative spectrum, and it's like, oh, well, they're not, I may not necessarily agree here or there, but it's not, the answer isn't because they're evil, right? It's because they have a different perspective on something or how things work. But I'm very curious. You mentioned growing up in China and you didn't want to be a communist. That I find that fascinating because the messaging and indoctrination there is extremely strong. So I'm surprised you were even exposed to alternative options.
Well, mostly is because I saw the hypocrisy of the leadership, like people who on the top who saying one thing and doing the other, and also I never actually bought into communism in a way because first of all, it never worked, right? And and also what we are doing in China was not really a communism. Communism in a way is a kind of for communists, that's a vision, that's in the future, right?
Right.
And you're trying to get there, but you have to build a dictatorship so that you can you build a society that was the state controls everything, and then however magically at the end of it the state will dissolve. Then you have a society where there is no country, no government, just like John Lennon's song, right? Imagine there's nothing there, but that just like never will happen.
Well, I think that's something a lot of people miss about communism is even Marx sort of states that it presupposes that people as we understand them now, it won't work, right?
Right.
And it takes a sort of constructivist view and it says, well, in order for this perfect utopia to come about, we have to sort of through the use of force, manually set up the environment to nurture it, and then hope that we can sufficiently engender the right morals in people for it to then work. And it's a really interesting and long-winded way to basically give the cop-out for if anything ever goes wrong. It's the theory is still sound. It's just they didn't quite run the experiment the right way.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's if you know a little bit of history about China, there was when the nationalists, when they took power, that before the communists. So the nationalists also promised democracy, right? But they said, okay, we are not ready for that. So we need to train people how to be a democracy. So in the meantime, you need some kind of military kind of dictatorship to make sure people are trained and educated in that way. But and so eventually, when that happens, then it'll become a democracy, and it never happened when they were in China. And after they was defeated, went to Taiwan, and that was not a democracy. It was much later on, and also because of the pressure from outside world. Right. So when you say something, you need a state to control everything, to educate people, to indoctrinate the people, and so eventually everybody becomes selfless, and that just really, in a way, just pipe dream, right? It would never happen.
I would argue there's a lot of evidence that says people just don't work that way, right?
No.
There's been a lot of folks throughout history who've tried different flavors of that, and the results seem to end up more or less the same, and it's often not a good outcome or a desirable outcome, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also, I think in a way, the communist indoctrination, that actually resonates with a lot of Christians, and a lot of people grew up in church. And because, I mean, we want to take care of the poor, right?
Right.
And we do see the inequality, and we do see, especially in other countries, you got very rich people on the top, then you got people have to live on the street, and they have to beg for living, things like that. So I mean, naturally, you want to help those people, right?
Yep.
So when I become a Christian in 1994 in Canada, then I moved to Indiana in 1995. At that time, to me, is that as a Christian, I cannot support Republicans, right? Because Republicans was kind of, at least it was portrayed by the media as like they work for the rich people, right? They don't care about the poor, and
right,
like that. And so Democrats who actually was caring about the poor. So, but but once
I know all too well. That's my exact same background, right? During that late 90s, early 2000s, you had that perception of the Republicans are the party of the fat cats and corporate protectionists, and then you had the warmongering of the 2000s under the Bush administration. All of that was deeply counter to what I believed. And if you're raised that politics are a binary, well, if I know I'm against the Republicans, I guess I'm a Democrat, right? Like by default, I must be a Democrat, right?
Yeah, what helped me is when I came to the United States, and then I met some Christians. They are way mature than I was at that time, and they support Republicans. So at first it was a shock to me, but when I started to learn what's going on, learn more about the history, the politics, and they're starting to realize that, well, in the Democrats, well, what actually made me kind of abandon the Democrat Party is because their position on abortion and homosexuality and all that. So then I just cannot support them.
Right.
But I'm still think it's good to take care of poor and all that. But the more I studied the history, and also since then, it's more than 20 years now living in Indiana, I started to realize that the Democrats are not really, I mean, not the rank and file, the establishment, and also those policies are not really helping the poor. I mean, they just give money to it, but by giving money, it's really made the politicians are rich, but not necessarily for the poor people.
Exactly. Money is given to the poor, but it's got to filter through a series of bureaucracies and programs and other things along the way. And that, yeah.
And then, I was actually watching a TV series, and it was made, I think, made in Italy. And there is one line which kind of caught my attention, is that there is this woman who is from kind of higher class, right? The kind of nobility background. And she made a kind of comment. And she said that there is money to be made on the poor. And so that kind of, I understand that, because I have seen over the years how many organizations are making money on the poor. I mean, they are trying to help the poor, but really help themselves.
Oh, even if they're not trying to help, it's that's the dirty little secret behind a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
The left will criticize like your televangelist mega church type organization, right? Because they claim to be whatever philanthropic or in favor of the poor, these type things. and then you find that they're fabulously wealthy and whatnot. The right criticizes government programs because they claim to help the poor, but oftentimes there's a wealth of what we at least hope are unintended consequences. Hopefully they're not intentional, that have a lot of negative effects on the people they claim to help. I mean, even our lottery system is, if you boil it down, it's essentially a tax on the poor to fund education.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely, yeah. Mhm. And also to me, the poster child of the left I like to use is Barack Obama, right? I mean, he definitely grew up in a middle class family, and he went to Yale and all that. I mean, it's kind of elite, but he went to uh, 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 south side of in Chicago,
Mhm.
and trying to be organizer. And from there, he became the senator of the state, and from there, senator of the United States, and become president.
Mhm.
And 8 years, and now, well, he really haven't helped any on the people on the south side of Chicago. Now he become a multi-millionaire. He was partying with billionaires. He made me helped him tremendously.
Yeah. So one of my favorite stories about that is, apparently there was an effort to build a presidential library, the Barack Obama presidential
Right.
library, in one of those sort of south side of Chicago neighborhoods.
Mm.
And essentially the same people who he claimed to represent or support or fighting on behalf of were aggressively fighting against it, because it was going to require, leveling and clearing out people's homes and all
Mm.
sorts of different things like that. And it was the argument was it was going to have a very devastating effect on their neighborhood. And it's so there's just a sort of a wonderful irony there, right? That this like huge multi-million-dollar project,
Right.
you could argue a vanity project, and it was negatively impacting the people who his career was sort of built around helping, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess there's many examples, right? You can have. I mean, there are people who claim to help the poor, but never really help the poor, really help themselves.
Yeah.
And their career is basically just doing that, right? In the name of the helping the poor. And which I grew up in China. I mean, that's familiar to me. You mean all the leadership said that they are serving the people, they are helping the people. Now, they really help themselves.
I'll say it pays pretty good to be a party member in China, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean that's why they, instead of they use they have some names which sound like a servant kind of position, like the secretary, right? The secretary of the party. I mean, that is most important position in the country. It's not just a secretary, but they just use those kind of titles, kind of is trying to fool people that they are there to help,
Right.
to work for the people, right? They work hard, so therefore they deserve, all kinds, privileges.
Yeah, they deserve to be just a little more equal than the rest, right?
Right.
That's the joke, at least.
Yeah, exactly. So and um what how say um in terms like Republicans politics and all that, so what, anything specific there you just don't agree with? And
Well, I definitely find myself more right leaning from an economic perspective.
okay.
I think, having been a former, maybe socialism is a good idea, and then learning more and reading more about economics, I find myself much more oriented towards a free market
Right.
system. So
Mhm.
I definitely have a strong alignment with Republicans in terms of, well, I shouldn't say, uh, they're less wrong on economics than the left are. The left, I
Right.
think, are quite wrong on economics.
Yeah.
And there's certain policies that I think are compatible. I mean, the right. I joke that a lot of right-wing politicians campaign like libertarians, right? They talk a big game about limited government
Right.
and
Right.
personal freedom and things like
Right.
this. But then, unfortunately, a lot of times when they find themselves in office, you start seeing them draft up bills that, well, the government's going to control this, and it's going to tell you what you need to do here, and we need to have these things in place. So, you know, I think on a political compass test, I'm somewhat right of center,
Mhm.
but I'm very strong. So if you're familiar with the political compass being a two-dimensional graph, right? You have left and right, which
Right,
everyone's,
right,
and then you have authoritarian versus libertarian,
right.
right?
Mm.
And that's essentially the, you know, how do we realize our policies? Is it through force or is it through voluntary cooperation?
Mm.
And I am like hard on the libertarian side, right? I'm very much more inclined towards voluntary cooperation, right? People should be free as much as possible to live their lives, right? There is still room for laws, right? We don't want theft, we don't want murder, we don't want
Right,
people
right.
defrauding others, things like that. But for the most part, I think it is safer to decentralize decision making to the individual.
Okay. So, what are the basic tenets of libertarianism?
Okay. Maybe the easiest to summarize, and it's a little bit weird to wrap your head around until you really read up on it, but one of the core elements of libertarianism is something called the non-aggression principle.
Okay.
And you'll hear libertarians say the NAP, right? NAP.
Mm.
And what that essentially means is that anyone who initiates force upon another, aggresses upon another, is essentially in the wrong,
Okay.
right? So if I want to, you know, if I want your house, I have to offer you terms that you would find acceptable so that we voluntarily make that exchange, whether
Right.
that's, you know, economic, like, hey, I would like to buy your house from you. Is this a fair rate, etc.
Mm.
And we reach an agreement. Or I really like your house. Can I offer you, you know, I've built this house in this better spot that I think you would like. Can we incentivize some kind of a trade?
Mm.
But I'm at any point, if I attempt to coerce or
Right.
force you out of that position, then I've transgressed against you, and that's
Okay.
unacceptable.
Okay.
So that's one of the core elements, and
Mm.
that the other major element is going to be property rights, and that feeds into a lot of other things. So
Okay.
property rights are, and you'll be familiar with this, having learned a lot about communism, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
you don't
Right.
always have property rights, but
Yeah.
in America, for the most part, you have right. You know, this mouse is mine. I
Right.
own it. I'm able to do with it as I see fit, as long as I'm not, you know, again, using it to hurt someone else or something like that, right?
Right. Yeah.
And by way of property rights, there's also self-ownership, right? So if property rights exist and I'm able to own things, then the most fundamental thing that I own is myself.
Mm.
And what that means is that I should have final authority on what I do to or with my body, right? So
Mm. Mm.
if I want to eat, you know, 5 cheeseburgers every day, then that's my decision to do. If I you know, want to do whatever, right? Then it's, if I choose to be vaccinated or choose not to be vaccinated, that's my decision because
Right.
I have ownership over my body. It's not the state or some other organization's role to dictate what I can and can't do.
Mm. Okay. And so now, how about abortion?
So that's a tricky one. If
Right.
you look at like the Libertarian Party platform, they've, to summarize it briefly, they've sort of taken, they've sort of sat that one out. Their argument is basically there's good arguments on both sides for why, like, protecting the rights of the mother versus protecting the rights of the unborn,
Mm.
and it's not a clear cut enough situation to weigh in on. So the party line is basically, it's not a clear cut case. So the best thing that we can do is say that the government should not weigh in one way or the other, and
Mm.
it should be decentralized to the individual, because that's sort of the least risky outcome from the party's perspective. Now, that said, in the party, individual libertarians, you'll see a broad range of opinions on that. There's
Okay.
some folks who, you know, they were formerly very much on the left end and they approach it from a very pro-choice standpoint.
Mm.
There's also, you know, groups, and I'm sure there's probably a caucus in the party that are in the pro-life camp, right?
Okay.
So, and you'll see some interesting arguments from both ends, right? Like on one side, the government shouldn't be able to force me to provide my body as a you know, means of sustaining another life. Like that's an overstep of what the government
Mm.
should be able to do. And then conversely, you hear people say, Well, that fetus is essentially a person, and
Right.
by aborting it, you're violating, you're aggressing upon that person, right? Like, you can't kill people. That's obviously not okay.
Right.
So being opposed to abortion is, protecting the civil rights of that child.
Right. Okay. So you do have like the wider range within the party, which kind
Yep.
of uh, they have different opinions.
Yep. And
Yeah.
that's lots of times, especially from the perspective of Republicans who are interested in libertarianism, that is one of two big things that they usually it kind of sets them back, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
hear us talk about small government, fiscal responsibility, limited taxation, all these type things. Like, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
No problem there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then when you get to more of our policies around like social tolerance, right? Like, we're,
Mm.
homosexuality and transgenderism and whatnot, right? As long as you're, you can do what you want to your body, right? And if
Mm.
you're dating someone of the same sex, as long as it's, consensual and nobody's, aggressing upon another, that's your business. It shouldn't be any policy of the state or the government to intervene upon that.
Mm. Yeah. I think another tough policy is on the marijuana, is legalization marijuana and all that.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, that's probably the other one that people get really hung up on. I mean,
right.
full on big L libertarians will have, and this is going to sound like a controversial opinion, but bear
Mm.
with me here.
Yeah.
But they're actually in favor of legalization of all drugs.
Mm.
Makes a lot of Republicans really, well, but
Right. Right.
they're destructive and harmful and all this, and you're spot on, right? Like, overwhelmingly, drugs are bad for people and they have very bad effects on people,
Right.
and shouldn't get involved in them. But the argument from libertarians, it's twofold. One, there's an ethical side of, if you give the government the power to regulate what you can do to your body for harmful things, you've essentially granted them the power to do to your body whatever, right?
Right. Exactly.
So there's a principled stance there. And then from a utilitarian standpoint, I mean, basic economics, if you look into things, bans don't work, right? Like,
Mhm.
we tried prohibition of alcohol
Right.
early in the 1900s, and that led to the organized crime and
Right.
gangster era and all that type of things that we saw, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Now we find ourselves in the era of the war on drugs, right? And
Mhm.
what has that done? Well, clearly there's a demand for it. And when there's a demand, people will rise up to satisfy that demand. And now that's given birth to, drug cartels, both in
Yeah.
our state and internationally.
Right.
And as soon as you drive things like that into a black market where it necessitates criminality to participate, you drive all sorts of unwanted consequences, right? Like gang warfare, right?
Yeah.
Turf wars over who can sell
Right.
drugs in what territory,
Right.
cartels, either attacking law enforcement or intimidating families or abusing people, all these type things. So
Mhm.
the argument from libertarians is, yes, drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs.
Mhm.
But what is more damaging, to acknowledge the fact that if you let them, some people will use drugs and it will have a negative effect on them, or to create an environment that generates these massively powerful cartels and all of the knock-on effects that happen from that. And plus, if you legalize drugs, you then open up a lot more pathways for intervention and treatment, right? If you're someone who finds yourself, I've been using whatever,
Mhm.
meth, right?
Mhm.
And it's I've hit my bottom and I'm ready to turn around. I want to get better, right? If it's legal, then there's no barriers to going to police, to counseling,
Right.
to
Right.
rehab, etc.
Mhm.
There's also the benefit of, if it's legal, right? How many times have you gone to the drugstore and bought Tylenol and found out it had 20% fentanyl content instead of 5% and overdosed,
Right.
right? Well, you don't, because you can buy it for sale legally. And so people who sell it are incentivized to not have it contaminated with all sorts of God knows what. And so then you
Right.
have deaths as a consequence of overdose and whatnot. So
Yeah.
it's a shocking position when you first hear it, especially if you're used to more of a Republican viewpoint.
Mhm.
But if you work through it, economically, and sort of look at how the knock-on effects work from policies like that, it's, in my opinion, a more pragmatic approach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you said early on, like if you allow government to dictate not to do something harm to you, they could use that same power,
Yeah.
you know, and that's what we see, right? During the pandemics, the
Oh,
government is trying to dictate, like, you know, you have to take the vaccine, you know,
yep.
and
Even
we
before that, I mean, we saw in New York, they were trying to ban, you can't buy a soft drink over a certain size,
oh,
or
really,
oh yeah, and you see proposals all the time of, well, people shouldn't be allowed to eat so much meat or do this or do that. And as soon as you say on the basis of health, the government can dictate that you should blank,
yeah,
you've opened up a Pandora's box of potentially dangerous, or at the very least infringing upon your rights, options for the government to pursue.
right, yeah, and we see that especially from the left, because, well, I mean, I know a lot of them are trying to do good.
Yeah,
A lot of, especially on the rank and files, and so I mean, I was one of them.
absolutely.
So, but I think one thing, the left are they are trying to use the government in a way to do good, but same, if you give the government the power to do good, then they will abuse it to do bad.
Yeah.
And we see that, I mean, right now, what's happening in China, I mean, at first they said they are trying to protect the people, right? They want to make sure there is no, you know, there's a, what call that in China, it's kind of like zero.
Yeah, the zero COVID or COVID zero
Yeah,
policy.
COVID zero policy and all that. But to do that, the government, you can see how invasive,
Yeah.
how much power, and sometimes how ridiculous that was done at the local level.
Well, and that's the trouble with absolutist policies, right? And that's again why libertarian folks, they default to, you have to set up a situation or a system that works overwhelmingly for the most part, but you have to accept there's going to be some fallout. Because as soon as you say it has to account for every variable, the amount of rigid authoritarian structure that has to be built around that for it to function, the saying is the juice isn't worth the squeeze, but the result is, the cost of absolutist policies is measured in human lives. I mean, any government that follows a policy along those lines invariably is where you hear atrocities, right? Between Cambodia or China or Russia or Germany, all these places that had hardline stances, and that's where atrocity happens.
Yeah, exactly. And things like, in a way, it was not at the first started, right? I mean, they need to have popular support when they rise to power, and they are doing something which most people think is good. It's just, you mean gradually and eventually they just have too much power on their hand.
Right.
Yeah, I remember when I was about like teenager, and at that time the government actually was I mean, there was kind of crimes and all that, right? There is a short period of time, so the government actually used very heavy-handed method, and basically they just like, there's not much. If the government think you are the bad people, the government can put in a prison and they can kill you and all that. But most people supported it because at first they were geared towards those, bad people.
Right.
And but eventually they had the power to, get to people who the government don't like. And just from there, I mean, no one is kind of safe.
Absolutely. And it's a story that's unfortunately been repeated a lot of times, and the outcome is no less chilling each time, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. And there is something, I think, on the Republican side, and is that there is also tendency that the Republicans want government to do something. I mean, of course, to good things.
Right.
But still, once the government has that power, and then, so one thing I think is controversial. now, I mean, I don't mind to have the controversy, but I think it's a good thing to. I mean, at least as an example, we can talk about is Florida. The government decides what kind of textbooks are allowed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so far, I agree with those things,
Mm-hmm.
but I just don't think that was the state government's role to do that. They should have given to the to the local school board, to the I mean to the people in each school district. They should decide what kind of curriculum and what textbook to use. And
Yep.
but you see that people wants to on the right wants to do that.
And that's precisely why I found I couldn't side with the Republicans, because they still have that bent towards authoritarianism, right? And that's the tricky thing with authority, is it's always great when it's doing the things that you want, right?
Right.
As soon as it's doing the things you don't, it's horrible and sometimes tragic, right?
Exactly.
So there's a part of me that respects it, because it at least seems to be fueled by a popular groundswell of support. So, maybe the pendulum swung too far to one side and this is a bit fixing it. But ultimately, I absolutely agree with you that the best way to solve those is to concentrate the decision as close to the individual as possible.
Right.
Even to the extent of, a lot of libertarians will tell you that they don't even like that there is, certainly the federal Department of Education is a gross overreach.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Even at the state level, right? That
Right.
that education should be a matter that's up to the parents, and they can, it shouldn't be predominantly offered by or borderline monopolized by the state, right? It should be much like a university, right? You should be able to, once your child is of age where you think it's appropriate, go to whatever school you think is appropriate and have them educated.
Exactly. Yeah. And now our state budget is over 50% is on education.
Yep.
And well, we haven't seen anything getting better. It only gotten worse.
Well, that's the crazy thing, isn't it? The costs keep going up. The quality doesn't seem to improve regardless of how much money is assigned to it. And the feedback you constantly get from educators and people in the system is it's not enough, right?
So it's not enough money, not enough money. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with you that even the state shouldn't have that kind of power to dictate what you can teach and what is the standard. They should give it to the parents. Parents decide what to do. Yeah,
completely agree.
Yeah, and so now you said that in Libertarian Party there are people from left and right. So what actually unify them? What put them together?
Well, as mentioned, right, political compass has two axes. So left and right predominantly is around economic orientation, and your vertical is your libertarian versus authoritarian. So you'll find the people who are more left oriented, again, more left-wing political orientation. It's a cooperative system, right? So you'll have something, and I kind of cheekily, I disagree with these people because I'm more right-leaning economically. But they'll have, like libertarian communism, so to speak, right? And the best example of that is really like the classic hippie commune example.
Right. I mean, that's fine. I mean, if they want to do that voluntarily.
And again, right? So that's why it's like, I don't think that it scales very effectively. But if you and a bunch of buddies want to go, set up a commune and hang out and knock yourself out, right? Like, that's cool. I'm 100% in favor of that. So you'll have people who are a bit more, now they've come over from, usually a lot of our members are sort of defectors from the Republicans or the Democrats, right?
Okay, right.
So they'll have a lot of baggage isn't quite the right term. That's not quite fair. But there's a lot of things that were their positions when they were on the left or right.
Right.
Libertarians, and they sort of still have those. And it's maybe, that's sort of what's keeping them more on that one side or the other of the spectrum versus being more centered up and being purely libertarian.
Okay, but would you say that the things unify them is the kind of in the opposite of totalitarianism? It's more kind of the government should stay out of it.
Absolutely. So what unifies them is voluntary cooperation, right?
Mhm.
Whether you're a libertarian socialist or an anarcho-capitalist, right? Both
Right.
of those essentially rely upon I'm not allowed to steal your things. I'm not allowed to coerce you by force. I'm not allowed to do all these things, right? If I want the watermelons that you're selling, I
Mhm.
either have to be participating in your commune and exchanging value that way,
Right.
or on a more right-wing economic policy, I have to I have to trade you my oranges, right? Or offer to, work in the field for a day
Right.
to
Right.
earn
Yeah.
a certain amount of watermelon or what have you, right? But it's
Right.
all ultimately based around consensual voluntary exchange.
Yeah. So now, in this middle term election, what do you see? Do you think Libertarian will get more support?
Uh, I think that there's a tremendous opportunity for it at this particular point, especially in where I live.
Okay.
I think that both, how do I put this? I think there's a tremendous division in our country between left and right. Everything has become, tribal politics, right?
Mm.
And folks on both sides are getting very much upset with the establishment forces within both parties, right?
Right. Yeah.
The progressive left can't stand the Nancy Pelosi's and Chuck Schumer's and all that of the world, right?
Mhm.
And the the sort of MAGA Republican faction, the more populist right wing, they don't like Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and all these people on the Republican side, right? So and even at the lower level, like state level, local level, people are getting fed up with what they're seeing out of their establishment
Right.
politicians. I mean,
Right.
even
Yeah.
Indiana is heavily Republican leaning. There's a very well entrenched Republican establishment here, and there's been a lot of activity lately, a lot of clamor from people that they're upset or displeased with what they're seeing, right? Governor
Mm.
Holcomb, with his policies around mask mandates and some
Right. Right.
other COVID related policies, that cost him a lot of support. There's a lot of people who were coasting along, let's say, and oh well, the Republicans, they're small government, so I'll vote for them.
Right.
And all of a sudden they're seeing in the news, wait a minute,
Right.
I've been putting Republicans in my whole life. Where is all these big government overreaching authoritarian policies coming from? I thought I was voting for the small government people,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's very much, because both sides, as they get more fractionalized, they're skewing more authoritarian, and
Mm.
it's driving out the people who aren't on board with that. And so I think there's a lot of people moving to the Libertarian Party. Indiana especially has been very successful. If you look at the voting results from the last presidential cycle,
Mm.
Joe Jorgensen was our national level candidate for president for the Libertarian Party.
Mm.
And if you look at like a heat map for voting, Indiana is a huge hotspot for support for
I
her as a
see.
presidential candidate.
I see.
If you look on the governor level, we had Donald Rainwater as our candidate
Right.
for governor that cycle. And I believe he placed second in several counties, mine included,
Oh, wow.
and got a substantial chunk of the vote, much more than you would typically see for a third party candidate.
Okay.
So I think there's a big movement in that direction, especially in light of the redistricting. The Republican establishment essentially used the redistricting to push out some of their more libertarian non-establishment members, and there's a lot of voters who feel disenfranchised
Oh,
because
yeah.
of that.
Mm-hmm.
And we as libertarians are here to welcome them into the fold, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, if they want to know more about the Libertarian Party, what can they do? Where can they go?
The simplest is going to be lp.org. That's our national level website. If you want to look up the platform there, it has several, again, sort of the national level platform behind what we're all about, the things that we believe in. lpin.org is the Indiana Libertarian Party. And I strongly encourage them to look for, we've got county level affiliates in most counties. I'm not sure all, but that's how I really got plugged in. Before
Okay.
that, I was just browsing the internet and reading and learning and whatnot. But my local county affiliated last year, and I was able to link up with some folks here locally, and that was really a big turning point. Getting involved in the movement, getting to meet people, getting to do stuff. So I can't encourage people strongly enough to check out their local libertarians.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it was my
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah, definitely really enjoying the conversation. So wish you all the best.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate that.
Well, I'll see you next time then.
Yeah, I'd love to do it again, and
Yeah.
we'll catch up about